It's the Bleav in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel, and we are sitting here on the afternoon before the afternoon of the NFL draft, and it just feels like forever to wait. We know the Texans fans might have to wait that much longer because the Texans are, as of now, picking at number 28. And when we look at 10 things to monitor with the Houston Texans, that's first and foremost. We all know Nick Caserio ain't sitting at number 28. He's going to move up or he's going to move down. And that's the first thing to monitor. And we've got the whole, at the very least, the first half of the first round tonight to monitor that. By the way, the Texans right now on FanDuel are plus 2,000 to win the Super Bowl. The Rams are favored at plus 700. If I were to go cross conference and bet on a team to win the Super Bowl from the NFC, I would never bet on anybody else other than the Texans within the AFC. But I don't mind going over the NFC. Vikings are at plus 4,500. I'm very intrigued by what Kyler Murray potentially does with Kevin O'Connell. So we'll see. We'll see exactly how much the odds are adjusted by things that happen tonight. But the number one thing to monitor is, hey, does Nick Caserio trade up, trade down, or stay put? And I think there's almost a feeling of a foregone conclusion that, of course, he's going to trade back. That's what he does. And we almost forget that, oh, wait a second. Nick was the guy who had one of the most aggressive trades in NFL history for a non-quarterback when they traded up to get Will Anderson. When they really like a guy, they're perfectly willing to move back up. They did try to move back up last year when the draft was in the mid-teens, and there were a few targets at that point that would have made a lot of sense. Nick, I know that because Nick Caserio himself said it. So this draft, it's dicey because it's not a strong draft. And you've got 15 or so guys that you think are definitely first-round caliber. Where it gets interesting is what does happen if we get to 14, 15, 16. And there's a few guys that the Texans like. Would they be willing to move up? There's a bunch of different dynamics at play there. I personally think it's actually more likely that they trade up this year than trade back. And we'll get into some of the other details and guys you want to watch as you start trying to handicap during the actual draft. The other big question that I think we in Houston have that people outside of Houston don't have as much. You look at mock drafts, and by and large, people are sending either an offensive lineman or a defensive tackle to the Houston Texans. And it makes sense when you look at the Texans depth chart and you see that, okay, well, look, they've got pretty much a guy they'd be comfortable with starting at any one of these spots. But they look at the depth chart and they don't necessarily know who Tommy Togiai is. They know that Sheldon Rankins is getting older. They're largely ignoring the fact that Logan Hall is also a starter who's going to rotate in. But then they look at the offensive line and they know that, look, yes, it looks good in terms of on paper. They've got the guys that they're going to start. Other than at center, where it's going to be more competitive, but those guys don't go in the first round, that it makes a lot of sense to go with an offensive lineman. I think the thing that they don't realize is that the Texans do not have as many pass rushers off the edge as they typically do. And you see the depth chart and you think, well, Will Anderson, Danielle Hunter, they're awesome, right? But last year, Danico Autry and Derek Barnett, they combined for about 500 plus snaps on defense. And those guys were really good, effective backup pass rushers. The Texans use a lot because they rotate those guys in. So there are in this draft, after you get past the top three, after you get past, the Reuben Baines and the David Balleys and Arvell Reeses, there's a bunch of guys that could go anywhere from the back half of the first round down to the back half of the second round. Just TJ Parker, Keldrick Falk, Akeem Messidor, 4 or 5 other guys that you can maybe throw in to that same lump there. And I think there's a chance that if there's a run on offensive linemen, that those guys are pushed down and the Texans feel like moving up there. The number 3 one, because this is involved with offensive linemen as well, Kaden Proctor, the offensive tackle out of Alabama. So if we're looking at the third thing to monitor tonight, Kaden Proctor is a guy that almost universally, every scout that you look at, every anonymous quote from a GM, whatever it might be, says, wow, God, you look at the guy and physically he should be a top 5 pick. And yet nobody's choosing him to go top 5. And he's the classic offensive lineman, the prospect that you wonder, why isn't he as consistently dominant as we know he's capable of? Why is he not always capitalizing on this freakish combination of size and athleticism? part of it is that he's had weight issues, and he comes in this year, weighs 400 pounds, ends up losing weight during the season after the team promised him that they would use him as a receiver at times if he did that. I'm torn on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because, all right, I like that the guy was able to lose weight once they put a carrot on a stick in front of him. I'd kind of prefer that he would be able to do it without having to have that carrot on a stick, because what does that end up looking like in the NFL after he's already got a guaranteed contract? But if you watch any of those highlights of him as a receiver, it is astoundingly impressive. Like, he looks like he's one of those high school running backs that's just bigger than everybody. He's just mowing guys down. He's making athletic plays to get into the end zone. It's really impressive. If he starts to slide, I have a couple of questions. One is, would the Texans actually trade up for him given the concerns about his consistency and his weight and all of that? Or if the Texans are still sitting there at 28 and he slides all the way down to 28, my gut tells me that the Texans, who have a higher standard than a lot of other teams on football character, maturity, swarm caliber type traits, if enough other teams passed on a guy who's definitely got a lot of talent and potential, I feel like by the time he gets to the Texans, that the Texans have probably already said no to him as well. So, and I don't feel like they would trade up for a guy that might have questions about his either smart, tough, dependable, the swarm, whatever acronym or slogan that you want to use. DeMeco did use smart, tough, and dependable in the press conference the other day, which I thought was a big step forward for our organization, that we didn't all freak out when we heard that term. For those of you who are new to Texans fandom, understand this. Smart, tough, dependable was something that Bill O'Brien said all the time, and yet they seem to keep drafting guys who either totally were not smart, or were not tough, or were not dependable, or sometimes all three. And it was very, very frustrating that they had all those motivational posters up there. Texans are plus 950 on FanDuel right now to win the AFC. I don't know how much the odds are going to move for most of the teams tonight, unless the Jeremiah Love dynamic comes into it. You know, I know, like Fernando Mendoza, everybody, that's baked into the odds already, wherever the Raiders are on various over-unders and whatnot. That's already baked into it. Jeremiah Love, and whether people, if he gets drafted really early and if somebody trades up to get him, that might move the needle, because he's that kind of force multiplier. Number 4 thing to monitor tonight, and I alluded to this early, but is there a run on offensive linemen early in the draft? And the trickle-down effect from this is where it really matters. If you start seeing a bunch of offensive linemen going off the board, two big things to monitor. It's still going to come back to defensive linemen and offensive linemen. Is A, if the Texans have a guy, and you know, Nick tries to stay strict to his draft board when it comes to not overdrafting. I don't think he's not gonna jump up to draft a guy that he thinks is worth drafting at 28, but desperately wants an offensive lineman, so he's going to go up and draft him at 15. That's just not going to happen. I don't think he's going to do that. But when those offensive linemen start going off the board, and maybe if all the guys that Nick is interested in, you know, but doesn't want to trade aggressively up for are gone, does that become the moment when all of a sudden defensive linemen or defensive ends, those guys are still sitting there? Maybe a guy that he had as like the 10th or 11th guy on his board is still sitting there at 14, 15, 16. I think there's a good chance that happens. So that's just one of the little things that's making me feel like that Nick might just take a jaunt, meander up on into the middle of the first round. Watch and see how many offensive linemen are going early. Number 5, the thing that might affect the Texans' strategy as well is, where does Ty Simpson get drafted, and does he make it past number 21 with the Steelers? So if the Steelers draft Ty Simpson, then all of a sudden the Texans are sitting back at 28, and the prospect of a team trying to trade up above 28 to draft Ty Simpson, just like the Giants did with Jackson Dart last year, that becomes a lot less likely. And that combination of, hey, Ty Simpson's off the board, we're not getting any enticing offers to move back in the draft. There's a few guys still sitting there at 22, 23, 24 that we'd really like, then maybe he makes the move up at that point. And it's not as aggressive, which is cool, because I'm greedy on draft day. I know long-term the best thing to do is to, accept trades where the value is good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to have as many picks as possible. Especially those 4 picks in the first 3 rounds. Please, I can talk myself into those guys super, super easy. Number 6 thing to watch. So we've talked about watching various players start to slide. Kaden Proctor, does he start to slide? Ty Simpson, does he quote unquote slide? Nobody's super enthusiastic about him as a prospect, but just how far does he slide down the first board? So number 6 is a guy I'm going to be watching is Kenyon Sadiq. And I don't think the Texans are going to try to be super aggressive and trade up to get him, because that you might be talking about trading up to 13 or 14 there. It'd be baller as hell if they did. But when Kenyon Sadiq gets to 14, if he gets to 14, that's Baltimore. And the teams right there in the middle of the draft that I think would be very much interested in Kenyon Sadiq, because they either have aging tight ends or they like using the tight end in their offense, and not to mention just that Kenyon Sadiq seems to be that type of prospect that he should be going mid-first round. 14, Baltimore. 15th pick, Tampa. Go to the 17th pick, it's Detroit. 18th pick is Minnesota. 19th pick is Carolina. Those teams, if they really like Kenyon Sadiq and then Kenyon Sadiq comes off the board, I think a few of those teams become very likely or potential trade partners for the Texans, partly because the Texans have worked with Detroit before. They just executed the trade with David Montgomery. They've worked with Minnesota. I think the chance of them already having had discussions, and when Tom Pelissero, which I can't remember if I mentioned earlier or not, Tom Pelissero reported that the Texans are making calls inquiring about trading up in the draft. And that doesn't shock or surprise me. He also said that they've been making calls asking about trading back. These are the the preliminary calls where you start to feel teams out about maybe what they're thinking. What kind of price are we talking if we do make a trade? So you can speak in shorthand when it comes to draft weekend. I think if one of those teams really is just hoping for Kenyon Sadiq and isn't really super enthusiastic about anybody else at that point, when Kenyon Sadiq goes off the board, maybe that's where the Texans take that opportunity to leap up into the mid-first round to take one of those edge rushers or to take an offensive lineman. We'll see. It's always very possible, obviously, that the Texans or that the offensive linemen don't actually, there's not a run early and there's a bunch of offensive linemen later on. There's a million different things that could happen, as we know. This is the 7th thing, and it's simply this. I'm really curious about Kaden McDonald and Peter Woods, the 2 defensive tackles that seem to be working their way into the consensus. All right, these are the number 1 and number 2 guys, but really it's more about the consensus around Kaden McDonald out of Ohio State. I've just seen multiple bigger time analysts, the ESPN guys and what have you, say that pretty much everybody they talk to thinks that Kaden McDonald, the defensive tackle, is going to be the first defensive tackle off the board. And then there are 4 or 5 other guys that are probably top half of the second round types of guys. But I'm not 100% convinced that there aren't more teams that are in on Peter Woods, because when you hear the way people talk about Peter Woods, okay, he's got a lot of physical potential. Think of him as a 3 technique defensive tackle. And yet he doesn't have the production last year that we would have wanted to see out of him. A lot of what they were saying about Will Anderson sounds similar. Now, Will Anderson is a much better prospect than Peter Woods. But if you look at Will Anderson, his second to last year in college, people were saying, wow, this guy definitely would have been a top 3 pick no matter what if he had come out that year. The next year, Alabama used him differently, put him in a position where he wasn't going to make as many plays. And then all the draft nicks and the draft analysts were saying the same things that they're saying right now about Peter Woods. So they're like, I don't know. The production just wasn't there. What happened to the guy from 2 years ago? Peter Woods moved inside, played a lot more, seemingly out of position for what he's talented doing, playing down at nose tackle and what have you. So I think that a team like the Texans, if you look at what Rod Wright, the defensive line coach, has been able to do with defensive linemen in terms of refining their technique and getting the most out of them, and then figuring out, all right, how much of it was the scheme versus the player? Why didn't he make more plays? they might like Peter Woods more than some other teams would because they could see the potential upside. With Kaden McDonald, he doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of the super enticing first round types of physical traits other than the size, but he just flat out makes a lot of plays. He makes tackles behind the line of scrimmage all the time. I think he's got a pretty good feel for the game of football. I know I've seen some of the knocks on him being play recognition and what have you. I feel like he's got a good feel for what the offensive line is trying to do to him, and he makes a lot of plays. So as David Culley would call him, a football playing Jesse. That's what he is. He's a football playing Jesse. So if Kaden McDonald and Peter Woods are still on the board when the Texans select, I'm still going to say Kaden McDonald. I think just the actual film and him making plays, him reminding me a little bit of Tim Settle, who the Texans ended up losing this year to free agency. I'm still going with Kaden McDonald. I just think it might be closer than what a lot of the draft analysts are saying right now. Number 8 thing to monitor. All right, and this is more for my own mental health. And I know that some of you are now going to troll me with this comment after I say this, but this is the one that drives me the most insane, is when on Friday I hear people say, why did they draft him in the first round when they could have gotten him in the second round? Or why did they draft this guy in the third round when they could have got him in the fourth round? We don't know. We don't know when any of these guys are going. We don't know what other teams' draft boards look like. And I think sometimes we spend so much time pre-draft looking at mock drafts, looking at various people's opinions, that you start in your mind to think, oh, well, of course this guy's a late second rounder. When in fact, it's a lot more nebulous than that from team to team and scout to scout and GM to GM. So the guys that I'm kind of bracing myself for this is if Chase Basantis from Texas A&M gets drafted by the Texans in the first round, I know there's going to be people that are just saying, what the hell? He's been going in the second round. Why didn't you just draft him with number 38? It makes it worse with the Texans this year because they have that 38th pick. So there's a whole lot of opportunity for people to think like, hey, they could have gotten him 10 picks later or wherever the Texans end up drafting in the first round, whatever the delta is there. The other guy, this is an interesting one, and I wouldn't have thought of this until I talked to John Harris, is Keelan Rutledge. So Keelan Rutledge, the offensive guard out of Georgia Tech, on average is getting drafted 51st. So very firmly there in the second round. John Harris talked about Keelan Rutledge and brought up a really good point, which is that I think a lot of people actually like him more as a prospect, or some teams like him more as a prospect than perhaps what the consensus thinking is, but that he also did play center at the Senior Bowl and seemed to do a pretty good job of it. So for the Texans, if you're looking at, all right, we've got the 2 starting guards already. One is an aging veteran at left guard. At Ingram at right guard, hopefully is going to be there and continue to develop as a pass protector, et cetera, et cetera. But center is a competitive position. And I think they'd be perfectly comfortable going out and playing with Jake Andrews in week 1. But I think that he's going to have to earn it. I think there's going to be a genuine competition at center. And you don't necessarily, even though it's a good year for centers, man, waiting around until late in the second round or in the third round to draft a guy who's a bona fide center or a projected center like Trey Zune, it feels a lot better if you can take a guy that might end up being a starting guard long-term, but also might compete at center right now and give you an option for a swing interior offensive lineman to add to some of the guys who are already there. I think there's a chance that it's not just the Texans that are thinking about Keelan Rutledge as a guard that they would select in the first round, but it's a possibility. And that's the one that I think would get the most people saying, what the hell are we doing here? Guys projected to go 51st and we're drafting at 28. I myself will be cool about it if that's what happens. The other one guy to monitor, that if the Texans end up with this guy, I wouldn't be surprised, but he's not being projected as a first rounder, Malachi Lawrence, the defensive end out of UCF. Now, he's on average getting drafted 37th. So we would get a minimal amount of people saying, why the hell did you draft this guy? But it's not going to be as extreme. I think this is number 9. I wrote Kaden Proctor twice on here, I think. So I did. So I misnumbered it, but this will end up being the 9 things to watch, unless I think of something between now and when I finish this. Number 9, do the Cardinals stay at 3 or trade out? So this is an easy one to watch and monitor. This is because of the Jeremiah Love quotient. And my belief that in a year where it's a weak draft, but you also have 6 teams that have 2 first-round picks, there are a lot of teams that are looking at what's going on in the league, and they're seeing that, hey, look, the running game is just simply more important than it used to be. It's not like it's been for the past 15 years or so where people thought the running game was dying, wasn't as important anymore. Defenses have loaded up to stop the pass, and as a consequence, defenses are lighter and more narrow-waisted than they've been in a long time. They are not set up to stop the run. They don't even the Tavondre Sweat, big hulking defensive tackles of the world anymore. Very few of those guys even in the NFL. And defenses don't stop the run as well. Offenses are starting to take advantage of it. And when you've got a guy like Jeremiah Love who gives you that Christian McCaffrey dynamic of, man, you can use him any which way you want. As a runner, as a receiver, he's also good as a blocker. So you're not as hamstrung as you sometimes are when you've got an electric runner as a rookie, but he doesn't know how to pass block. I think that somebody of those teams or somebody else is going to get a little bit frisky and want to trade up for Jeremiah Love. So my bold prediction for the night, which is probably maybe a 50-50, is that Jeremiah Love goes number 3 overall to a team that isn't the Cardinals. The good part about that would be, let's make this number 10. What do the Titans do at number 4? I don't want them to have the option of drafting Jeremiah Love. I really, really don't. And this is simply that it's if you think that Cam Ward has a potential to be a really good NFL quarterback, you're going to find out much sooner if he's got Jeremiah Love as a running mate. The good side of it is that, man, many teams have tried this theory and philosophy of drafting a quarterback with a high pick early 1 year, and then the next year or the same year drafting a running back. And we saw that in Jacksonville. We saw it in New York with Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley, where they did it in reverse order. They had the running back and then the quarterback. But still, the best version of Daniel Jones you saw when he was in New York was when Saquon Barkley was also healthy and producing and doing a lot of things to make life miserable for defenses. And Brian Daboll, who was the coach up there, he's now in Tennessee as the offensive coordinator. I think if you really want to help out Cam Ward, who didn't get a whole lot of help last year from his offense, and I'm talking his receivers, his offensive line, everybody. He just did not have a lot to work with. You can do a lot with Jeremiah Love. Could you also do a lot with offensive linemen? Could you do a lot with wide receivers? Yes. But Jeremiah Love is, I think, one of those force multiplying type of players that actually makes those other positions better. Usually you talk about a quarterback making those other guys better. I think Jeremiah Love has the ability to make that offensive line look better. I think he's as a receiving threat, he puts a little bit more doubt into the defense, and there you go. The other one question I'd have, since we're on Jeremiah Love, is just where Jadarian Price goes. And I haven't seen in 3-round mocks and what have you, I haven't seen the Texans take Jadarian Love. I'd be surprised if they did. I think that it would be awesome, but I also know they just traded for David Montgomery, and David Montgomery wasn't all that enthusiastic about having to split carries up in Detroit. He wants to be the main guy. If he comes in, he would still start off the season as the main guy. Woody Marks is going to get a lot of touches. I hope Woody Marks is used more as a receiver now that David Montgomery is there. And it becomes like I wouldn't not draft somebody because I'm worried the veteran running back might be upset about it. They didn't give him a new lucrative contract or something, or a huge contract. But man, they get injured, and David Montgomery's 1 year older, and Woody Marks we saw have his issues with injuries all season long. That's the little wild card that I'd love to see. I don't think we're going to see it tonight. I'll be surprised if Jadarian Price gets drafted in the first round. Those are the 10 things to monitor. Did I get up to 10? I can't even remember if I made it to 10 or not. I think I made it to 10, and then I dusted on into another one with Jadarian Price. Let me know if you're watching before the draft, if anything I missed. And if you're listening to this tomorrow, tell me exactly where I was wrong in the comments. If you're listening on Apple, please give a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, and all the rest of it. And thanks for watching or listening to the Bleav in Texans podcast, brought to you by FanDuel. Everybody have a great one.